The job of a state rep is to represent their community in the state legislature. Kristen Arute is a licensed educator, small business owner, and president of Hingham Cares. With her background so tightly tied to those local, how does Kristen plan to address the concerns of Plymouth County in this fall's upcoming election? Hello, I'm Joe Collymore, and welcome back to another edition of Close-Ups. My guest today is Kristen Arute. She is a native of the South Shore. She's a 27-year resident of Hingham. She is president of Hingham Cares, and she's on the board of the Hingham Council on Aging. She's a math instructor, a licensed middle school math instructor. She's run her own small business, and she is a candidate for the Plymouth 3rd District for the state representative. Welcome, Kristen.
Thank you for having me, Joe.
I'm great to have you here. I'm so excited. We've had an opportunity to sit with and have conversation with your opposition, the incumbent State Representative Joan Moschino. So we really appreciate giving you an opportunity as well to sit with us to give our viewers a better sense of who is Kristen Arute, what sort of are the issues that you stand for, and what are some of the contributing factors that has helped shape and mold where your focus and your passion is. Tell us a little bit more about you, Kristen, the individual, the mother, and resident of Hingham.
Well, as you stated in your intro, I am a lifelong resident of the South Shore. I grew up in Norwell, and my parents just recently sold their home. I have been in Hingham for close to 27 years. I have 2 children. My daughter is 26, my son is 21. He's still in school. He's a finance major. My daughter is working in the retail fashion industry and doing quite well. She's a web art director for a local company. I have a varied background. I've done a number of different things. Most currently, though, I'm president of Hingham Cares, as you mentioned, which is the Substance Misuse Prevention Coalition in Hingham, addressing some very important issues with regard to the opioid crisis and substance abuse. I am a remedial math instructor. I've worked in local school systems working with children who struggle in math, and I'm a private math tutor. I've been doing that for 14 years. Ran a small business for 13 years, and in addition to being a member of the Council on Aging, I've been retained privately to manage the affairs of an elderly woman. And during the course of delving into her financial situation, I discovered that she had been abused, financially taken advantage of. And that case was just recently resolved through FINRA, through the process of that the industry has established. And we're thrilled about that, but it was a really challenging situation that I pursued for 4 years. It took 4 years to get restitution for her. So that's something that I feel very passionately about, is making sure that that industry is held accountable, making sure that bad actors are held accountable, and making sure that the senior population is aware of the types of fraud and abuse that exist out there.
Let's talk about that a little bit more. My mom is 85, and she lives alone. She's in reasonably good health. But what I'm finding is that she's getting a lot of telemarketing calls, some of which are scams, attempts to get her to switch her utilities and things of that nature. Can you share with us a little more about what you're seeing out there in our community relative to elder financial abuse, and what are some of the remedies or controls, if you will, that you'd like to see in place?
I think one thing that's very important, and I know a lot of banks are very proactive with regard to this, is helping tellers identify individuals who seem distraught, who may come into the bank and look to withdraw a large amount of money. And without breaching any privacy law, allowing these tellers the opportunity to not just identify, but also engage the individual who's come into the bank so that they can help sort of navigate and understand exactly what that large withdrawal is going to be used for, especially if there are indications of emotional distress. because one of the areas of fraud that we see is, to your point, these phone calls that the senior population receives where they're told that the IRS is going to be taking action against them and they need to send a sizable amount of money to X, Y, or Z, or a loved one is in distress and they need to send money somewhere. So anytime there's something that can be red flagged, to enable those tellers to engage in further conversation and advise law enforcement as well. I think it's a matter of communicating with the community and being proactive in that sense.
I've heard of the blank check test. What exactly is that? I mean, in terms of as it applies to our seniors. Have you heard of that same?
No, the blank check test is something that a primary care physician of individuals within the senior population could perform at a routine wellness visit. And it would indicate whether or not the individual is capable of managing basic financial management details of their own personal finances. I know that that is certainly an issue. It's something that family members can keep an eye on. You don't need to place a physical check in front of someone, but there are certainly probing questions that family members and loved ones can ask of senior members. Again, if you're close enough to someone and you recognize some of those warning signs, it's important to engage in those conversations, much like we do about anything. You know, if we see someone that we care about who's in distress or appears to be struggling with something, then it's important to gently start those conversations.
I've heard it reported, I believe, on one of our local radio stations that focuses on elder affairs, that approximately 10,000 people every day turn the age of 65 and will continue to do so into 2030. I mean, when we talk about the boomers, of which I'm a member of, and so we are the fastest growing demographic in that context of seniors and elder affairs. And so a lot of attention and energy is now being pivoted and focusing on how do we support the needs of this ever growing population. One area is, shall we call it, aging in place. Can you share with us your thoughts and views on what that means to your constituents here on the South Shore, and how can you make that possible for us, and what does it mean?
Aging in place is a very viable option for people. It's certainly an appealing option for people, as opposed to selling their home and moving into an assisted living facility or a nursing home or some other. Not that there's anything wrong with those facilities, but some people choose to stay in the home that they're familiar with. However, the older they get, the more challenging it becomes. And it becomes challenging financially. It becomes challenging in terms of the level of care that they require. My great uncle just passed away in February. He aged in place. He and my great aunt lived there in the same home for close to 70 years. However, it became financially challenging for him to remain in the home. He was mentally, he had, full use of his mental faculties. However, physically he was frail and failing. So he required support for those concerns that he had, and it was very expensive. So we can do, in terms of legislation on Beacon Hill, I believe the state legislature can do initiate some things in terms of allowing seniors to receive reductions in their taxes, tax credits. I think that the senior population is well deserving of that, having paid into the system for a number of years. I think we can do some things to allow seniors to tap into what otherwise would go toward helping them live in a nursing home setting. So a voucher system perhaps might work for certain individuals. So there are a number of different things that we can do. I know that Hingham just recently adopted a bylaw that would allow individuals to create additional living spaces within their homes. And that space could be used for family members who are looking to care for aging family members. It could be used for care providers who can live within the home and provide 24/7 care to someone who requires it. And all of that assists an individual in, basically, it allows them to have that choice, whereas otherwise they wouldn't have that choice to remain in their home.
That's a good point. When we talk about giving our seniors opportunities to age in place, part of our healthcare system will be challenged, I think, because of the projected shortage in nursing, certified nursing assistants, if you will, and other caregivers. We are already starting to see examples where new models, virtual monitoring, virtual caregiving, to at least establish some modicum of quality of attention to that senior who may be living alone. And even though a caregiver may not be coming in on a daily basis, at least you still have an ability, almost like a baby monitor.
Right.
You have the ability to monitor that senior should they have a medical issue come up. Speaking of which, when we talk about medical issues, we know, we have an opioid crisis that's playing out in many communities across this country, and more specifically here in our South Shore and in our 3rd Plymouth District. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts? What are your issue that you take strong relative to addressing this opioid crisis? Can you share with us a little bit about that?
Well, it certainly has been devastating, and there are lots of moving parts. There's the medical community, there are the illicit drugs that are sold on street corners, there are children who are struggling and looking for ways to mitigate the stresses of life. So one thing that we do with Hingham Cares is we work very closely as a prevention coalition. We work very closely with SAD, which is Students Against Destructive Decisions at Hingham High School. And we also work very closely with the DARE officer at Hingham Middle School to support them, to provide them with programming opportunities. Last year, we brought in a film that was recently created by a family who lost their son due to a combination of Xanax and alcohol. And it spotlighted, for one thing, the party culture that some children are exposed to, and their lack of awareness of, what is combined, or what can be combined in a healthy and safe way, and also draws attention to the fact that people who are taking prescription drugs for any particular reason have to be very careful when it comes to combining those drugs with alcohol.
Are we testing our students in schools for substances, for drugs? And if we are, what grades are we doing that in?
Well, just recently the legislature adopted legislation to institute a program called the SBIRT, S-B-I-R-T. And that program enables school systems to do a routine screening. I believe it's 5 questions where they ask students to determine their proclivity, their proclivity to potentially become addicted to substances, or to even determine whether or not they're using substances currently in an inappropriate way. And Hingham just instituted the SBIRT. I believe it was done at the 8th grade and 10th grade level. And it's a routine screening that the school nurse does. Again, 5 questions.
Is that for every 8th grade student, every 10th grade student in Hingham Public Schools?
Yes.
The subject to that?
Yes.
Can parents opt out?
Parents are able to opt out,
Okay.
Absolutely. Yep, parents have full control to do that. They also, I would recommend strongly that parents take a look at the questions that are being asked, because it could be that they're a little more, someone who may have concerns over privacy and their children may find that the questions aren't as intrusive as they may think that they are.
And again, these are questions that are being administered by the school nurse as opposed to maybe one of the resource officers or guidance counselors in the school.
Exactly.
Is it important that it's a nurse as opposed to the guidance counselor?
Well, a nurse would have more of a medical background, obviously. So if there is some substance use, then the nurse would be able to identify appropriate actions to take. And families are certainly notified if anyone shows up, any student shows up on the radar screen as having an issue.
Let's stay on the subject of education for a minute, and let's talk about testing, and more specifically, the high-stakes testing. I believe that you have taken a public position as it relates to greater local control, state control, as it regards the high-stakes test and Common Core. Is that correct?
I have worked, as I mentioned, in a number of different school systems on the South Shore as a remedial math instructor and in a variety of different grades, and I've seen just how disruptive high-stakes standardized testing is, not just to the classroom setting and classroom learning and teaching time, to the prep time that teachers have to invest into making sure that students are familiar with the technology, for example, specific keystrokes, the timing, there's all kinds of prep work that goes into getting students prepared for these high-stakes tests. But in addition, there's a population of students that have tremendous anxiety when it comes to high-stakes standardized testing and do not perform well as a result. And we need to make sure that we're taking that emotional component into account as well. It's also very expensive. It's an expensive venture for a school system and for the state. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it's very, very expensive. So my stance is that I feel as though we've gone to we've gotten to a point where we need to be pulling back. We need to be pulling back and being using a little more discernment when it comes to appropriate times, appropriate subject matter, appropriate ages for standardized testing.
You also have a position about Common Core. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that? Are you in support of or against the use of Common Core standards, state standards?
There. I do think that the one-size-fits-all approach to subject matter is not necessarily the best approach, and I've seen that not work in the later grades, specifically with math. I think that we need to be taking a closer look at some of the standards that we have, in particular for sixth grade, where sixth grade is such a pivotal year for kids. They're leaving the elementary school, they're moving on to middle school. We want to make that transition as pleasant as possible. And currently the standards for sixth grade math are very extensive, which makes it challenging for teachers and students alike. So I can see benefits and I can see pros and cons, I guess, in a nutshell.
As a state representative, looking at our students who are coming out of high school, and perhaps the majority have aspirations to go on to higher education in college, if you will. But we've got trades, high skill, high demand, if you will, and the concern is, are we giving students full exposure to some of these key critical trades? What's your feeling and position about that? And as a state legislator representing the 3rd Plymouth District, what can you say to the voters? What can you say to the parents, to the students who could perhaps benefit from your leadership in that respect?
That's a very interesting question because it encompasses a lot of different things. College debt, certainly, and I think that students need to be encouraged that they can explore other options, that they don't necessarily have to pursue a 4-year college education. Associate's degrees are available, certification programs. But I believe that in the public school setting, so the K through 12 setting, we can do a better job of preparing students for these real-world experiences, not just in the trades. We can certainly look to invest more in those types of programs in the school setting. We can do certification programs within the school setting. I had a conversation just recently with someone who, she lives in Pennsylvania, and she works in a high school setting. It's a private high school where she teaches marketing courses and business courses, and students in her classes actually receive certification in specific programs. So they graduate from high school already ahead of the game. And we can be doing more for our young population in terms of that, getting them ready for experience outside of the classroom, outside of the public school setting. I also think, in particular with math, and again, this would be my field of expertise, we can be doing more in terms of preparing students for real-world math experiences. shopping for a car, determining what their student debt is going to be and how they're going to respond to that student debt once graduating from college. Balancing a checkbook. It's not just seniors who need to be aware of maintaining or managing their personal finances, but we need to be graduating young people who can manage their finances. We send them off to college, and there's a whole lot of responsibility that's placed on their shoulders. So yes, I think that we can do a lot more to promote students who can be better prepared, better equipped for getting out into the quote-unquote real world.
Especially when we can produce students who can successfully obtain higher paying jobs, which in turn feeds back into our economy and more specifically into our tax base. Speaking of which, let's probe a little bit more into taxation. And I believe you've taken a position insofar as reasonable taxation.
Yes.
What do you mean by that? How does that apply in the context of residential taxation as compared to small business taxation in our community?
Well, I think taxation, there's a time and a place for it, and I think that it also can be a detriment, specifically to small business, to home ownership, to getting ahead in the world. My children are 26 and 21. It's challenging for kids to graduate from college, be burdened with student debt, search for a job within their field, and find a job that adequately allows them to make a living and manage the costs of living that they're exposed to now that they're living independently. So we certainly want to make sure that we can find a balance there. I think one of the concerns that I have about initiatives being put forward on Beacon Hill is that they seem to be very much in favor of looking for revenue opportunities as opposed to looking to inspire growth. So for example, I just read this morning that the legislature approved the Airbnb tax, the short-term rental tax. My family owns property in North Truro. We rent out that property. It's one little cottage in North Truro. We rent it out seasonally, and it's already challenging to make ends meet, to make it not just, we're certainly not earning an income on that rental property, but we're looking to maintain a balance between the cost of that rental property and the income that we receive. And additional taxes, additional fees, additional paperwork just makes it that much more burdensome. And we're not alone. No number of people just in Truro who own property who are in the same position. So anytime the state legislature imposes a new tax, there's bound to be a domino effect. And I think one of the things that needs to be more closely examined is what is that domino effect, understanding the nuances of the effect of that new taxation proposal. And I think we also need to take a closer look at our state budget and how we can rein that in. It's not all about revenue, it's about cost-cutting measures as well. And I think we're a little hesitant to cut costs, even if they're viable, because we don't want to be short-shifting programming within the state.
You've gone on record as supporting Governor Baker's plan. Mm-hmm. To our voters here in the 3rd District, where would you differ? What separates you from Governor Baker relative to the state plan?
Well, I think Governor Baker has done a tremendous job with regard to the opioid crisis. He has attacked that head on. We have established groundbreaking legislation in that regard, and other states around the country have replicated that legislation. So I think that he's done great things and made great strides in that area. I think we would probably differ on some of these taxation proposals. I'm not sure how he'll, if he'll support this most recent act by the state legislature, if he'll support the Airbnb bill, or if he'll veto it. That will be interesting to see. But I think that maybe some fiscal issues, there may be some discrepancies. But no, in general, I absolutely wholeheartedly support everything that the governor is doing. And he's the most popular governor in the country. I'm sure you know that, with a 70 or 80% approval rating, and there's a reason for that. I think he's done a tremendous job reaching across the aisle, bringing people together, and just in general working very hard for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
You are running for a second time, against Joe Moschino.
Yes.
What are you looking to do differently this time around, and what message do you want the voters to hold on to that's going to make a difference for you this time around?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because yesterday, the countdown to Election Day continues, and yesterday was the 100th day until the general election. In 2016, when I jumped into the race, I jumped in on the 100th day. So I ran for a total of 100 days. I refer to that race as my marathon. I'm sorry, have it backward. I refer to that race as my sprint, and this is my marathon. So I've had the past 2 years, I've had a lot of time to develop name recognition, and to make sure that the voters are aware of who I am, what I stand for, my platform. So my message hasn't changed so much as I've been able to make myself more accessible and make the voters more aware of who I am and what I stand for.
That's great. Is there anything else that you want to share with our viewers that I haven't touched on? Anything you want to touch on?
I would just encourage people to vote. I think becoming familiar with the issues, when I go to someone's door and they say they're not entirely familiar with the race, they don't know my opponent, they don't know me very well, my push card has a lot of information on it, and I encourage them to do a little compare-contrast. Take a look at what I stand for, take a look at my track record, take a look at what my opponent stands for, take a look at her track record, and do your own comparisons. You know, do a little research. And I joke, you know, you have 4 months to get to know me. You have 4 months to become educated on this particular race. I know that people tend to be familiar with things that are taking place at the national level because it's all over the media. We can't escape it. People tend to be familiar with very local issues as well. It's all over social media. And then, of course, you know, we know people in our own communities who are running for office, that sort of thing. But a race of this caliber can fall under the radar screen a little bit for people. So one of the goals of door knocking is to make sure that this race is in front of people and people get to know the candidates. One issue that I like to draw attention to people, it's relatively unknown. It's a bill that was proposed by the Senate a year or two ago. It's called Senate Bill 81, and I refer to it as the regionalized zoning bill. And it's a bill that would establish an additional layer of government to our already existing governmental system. It would establish regional boards that would oversee the implementation of new zoning laws. And it would essentially strip local zoning control from communities and place it in the hands of these newly established boards, these boards established by the legislature. So communities would no longer have control over development within their communities. They would no longer have control over the direction of their town's character. And those are very, very important issues statewide. You know, people have a lot of town pride, city pride. But specifically in my district, I know in Hull in particular, there's not much room for development, and there's very little open space, and people are concerned about overdevelopment. So this is a bill that I'm keeping my eye on. I would encourage the voters to keep an eye on, and it's also a bill, an issue where there's a tremendous amount of daylight between me and my opponent.
I want to thank you for taking this time with us.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Well, this concludes our episode of Close-Ups, and we want to thank Kristen Arute, our guest today. Stay tuned for the next installment of Close-Ups. This is Joe Collymore wishing you a great remainder of the summer.